3 collection bays stood at the edge of the equipment yard, each one stacked waist-high and labeled in black paint: Apple, Peach, Cherry. A box truck idled beside the cherry bay, its driver checking a clipboard against a stack of crates. Gilbert Hudo walked the row with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to someone on the other end before he lowered it and looked for Terrell Voss. "Cherries starting Monday," Gilbert said, once he found him checking moisture readings near the drying shed. "How much?" Terrell asked. "More than last year. Keep it off the wet ground and I'll take every clean piece," Terrell said, and Gilbert nodded like that settled it. Because it did. 18 months earlier there had been no bays, no labels, and no truck waiting on cherrywood. 18 months earlier there had only been one thing at Briar Hill Orchard every winter: a burn pile, tall and smoking, fed by whatever the pruning crews dragged out of the rows that day. Terrell Voss was 19 that winter, living with his mother Denise on the edge of town in a house that needed a new roof more than either of them liked to admit. Denise worked the register at the pharmacy in town, and the property tax bill had come in higher than expected that year, sitting on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks before either of them mentioned it out loud. She'd started picking up an extra shift some Saturdays just to chip away at it, coming home tired in a way that made Terrell notice more than he used to. Terrell picked up seasonal work at Briar Hill every winter during pruning season, running a chainsaw and hauling brush for crews who moved faster than he could always keep up with. On weekends, he worked the smoker pit at Underwood's Barbecue, a small restaurant on the edge of downtown, mostly stacking wood and hauling ash, sometimes watching the pitmaster, a heavy-set man named Wendell Price, load split logs into the firebox before a long cook. Terrell didn't know much about barbecue beyond what he'd picked up watching Wendell work. He knew a little about wood. The way anyone who'd grown up cutting firewood for a house that heated with a stove knew wood. What burned hot, what burned slow, what needed to dry out before you bothered with it. He didn't know anything yet about smoking wood as a business, and he didn't know that the 2 jobs he worked, one at an orchard and one at a barbecue restaurant, were about to collide. Pruning season at Briar Hill ran through the coldest stretch of winter, crews moving row by row through the apple, peach, and cherry blocks, cutting back limbs to shape the trees for spring growth. Branches fell everywhere, crooked, twisted, too small for lumber, too irregular to stack neatly, and a tractor dragged them into a central yard where they were piled and eventually burned, because burning was cheaper and faster than hauling them anywhere else. The pile grew taller every day that first week Terrell worked it, until it stood higher than the flatbed trailer parked next to it, smoke curling off the edges most mornings from whatever had smoldered overnight. Gilbert Hudo ran the pruning operation, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who'd managed Briar Hill's field crews for over 15 years. He didn't have much patience for anything that slowed a crew down during pruning season, since the window to get every row cut back before the trees budded out was short and unforgiving. "That's pruning waste," Gilbert told Terrell one frosty morning, catching him staring a little too long at the pile instead of loading the tractor. "Son, if somebody wanted it, they would have picked it up years ago," Gilbert said, not unkindly, just stating what he clearly believed was obvious. Terrell didn't argue with him. He kept working, but the comment sat with him the way things sometimes did, turning over in his head on the drive home. The rows themselves were something to see that time of year, bare apple and peach and cherry trees stretching in long lines under a gray winter sky, frost still clinging to the lowest branches most mornings until the sun burned it off. Crews worked in pairs, pruning shears snapping and chainsaws buzzing further down the row, branches falling in a steady rhythm that the tractor driver gathered up almost as fast as they hit the ground. By midweek, the central pile had grown wide enough that it took real effort to walk around it, a tangled wall of crooked limbs waiting for a match, smoke already rising off the edges some mornings from whatever had smoldered through the night. It was 2 nights later, working the pit at Underwood's, that the second half of the puzzle showed up without him going looking for it. Wendell was on the phone with his usual wood supplier, and Terrell could hear the frustration in his voice from across the kitchen. "I ordered apple," Wendell said, "and half this box is something else. I can smell it the second it hits the coals." He hung up annoyed, tossed 2 logs back into a crate, and muttered that he'd have to pick through the whole delivery by hand before service. "What's wrong with it?" Terrell asked. "Mixed species," Wendell said. "Somebody's cutting whatever's on hand and calling it apple because it sells better." He held up a chunk of wood from a small mesh bag sitting near the register, one Terrell hadn't noticed before, a bag no bigger than a sack of ice with a printed label reading Cherry Smoking Chunks, 5 lb. "How much does that cost?" Terrell asked. Wendell told him, and the number was more than Terrell expected for something that fit in one hand. That was the moment the question actually formed in his head, plain and simple. Why does this cost money over here when they burn it for free over there? He didn't tell anyone what he was thinking that night, not even Wendell. But the next morning at Briar Hill, he watched the burn pile a little differently. Close enough to the flames to feel the heat, close enough to notice for the first time that different branches smelled different as they caught, one sweeter, one sharper, one almost floral before it all blurred into smoke. He pulled a few unburned pieces aside before his shift ended that week, apple by the look of the bark, and took them home in the bed of his truck without telling Gilbert exactly why. His first idea was simple, and it turned out to be wrong in almost every way a first idea can be wrong. He figured fruitwood was fruitwood, cut it to size, let it sit a few days, and sell it as smoking wood, the same way he'd have sold any other firewood. He spent an evening cutting a mixed batch of apple, peach, and whatever else he'd grabbed without paying close attention, splitting it into chunks with a hatchet, and bagging it in a few old feed sacks. He brought a sample to Wendell the following weekend, proud of it in a way he tried not to show too much. Wendell tossed a couple pieces on the coals during a slow afternoon, just to test it, and the smoke that came off was thin, grayish, and faintly sour instead of clean. "This is still green," Wendell said, turning a piece over in his hand, "and I can't tell what's in here. Looks like you've got 2 or 3 species mixed in the same bag." He wasn't cruel about it, but he wasn't gentle either. "Fruitwood's fruitwood," Terrell said, half a question already sensing the answer. "No, it isn't," Wendell said. "Apple's mild. Peach is sweeter, kind of floral. Cherry's got that reddish tint and a little more bite to the smoke. You mix all 3 together and cook it too green. All you get is steam and bad flavor." He handed the rejected bag back across the counter without much ceremony. A regular customer sitting at the counter that afternoon, an older man who ran a hardware store 2 blocks over, glanced at the bag and asked what it was. "Orchard scraps," Wendell said before Terrell could answer. "Kid's still figuring it out." The man laughed, not meanly, just the easy laugh of somebody who'd heard plenty of half-formed ideas come through that counter over the years, and went back to his plate. Terrell drove home with the rejected batch still in the truck bed, the sourness of Wendell's smoke test still in his nose. He sat on the tailgate for a while before he carried the wood inside, turning the whole idea over the way he had the burn pile a few nights earlier. Mixed, green, and unlabeled wasn't a product. It was just wood that hadn't earned the right to be called anything yet. He started asking Wendell more questions after that, catching him during slow stretches at the restaurant, instead of trying to sell him anything. Wendell explained that serious smoking wood customers cared about species first, because each one carried a distinct flavor that pitmasters built their menus around. He explained that moisture mattered almost as much. Green wood smoked dirty and bitter, while wood seasoned down to the right dryness burned clean and produced a thin blue smoke instead of thick white smoke. He explained that size mattered too, chunks for offset smokers, different sizes for different pits, and that customers wanted consistency batch after batch, not a surprise mix each time they opened a bag. Terrell decided to pick 2 species to start, apple and cherry, since those were the 2 Wendell used most, and the 2 Briar Hill pruned the heaviest. He went back to Gilbert and asked, more specifically this time, if he could take branches by species instead of just grabbing from the general pile. Gilbert shrugged and told him he could take whatever he wanted off the burn pile before it got lit, since it saved the crew a few minutes of dragging. That was permission enough to start, even if it wasn't the structured partnership it would eventually become. Terrell built a simple sorting system in the corner of the yard, apple branches in one stack, cherry in another, everything else left for the fire. He cut the wood into rough chunks with a bow saw, stripped off the worst of the bark and dirt, and set it under a lean-to at home to dry. He had no real way to measure moisture yet, so he guessed, mostly by weight and the sound two pieces made when he knocked them together. Weeks passed before he brought Wendell a second sample, this time properly separated by species and dried longer than his first attempt. Wendell tested the apple first, and the smoke came off thinner and sweeter than before, close enough to what he normally bought that he nodded without saying much. The cherry took a little longer to catch, but once it did, the color and smell were closer to right too. "This is better," Wendell said. "Still not perfect, but better." He agreed to a small trial order, 10 bags total, split between the two species, enough for 1 weekend of slower cook service. Terrell delivered the order himself, bagged in the same old feed sacks, and Wendell paid him in cash that came out to a little over $200. It wasn't much money against a family property tax bill, but it was the first real proof that somebody would pay for wood that had been sorted, dried, and treated like it mattered. He kept working both jobs through the rest of that winter, splitting evenings between cutting and drying wood at home and hauling ash at the restaurant, learning as he went. He learned that a moisture meter, even a cheap one, told him more in 5 seconds than a week of guessing by weight ever had, and he saved up enough from his orchard wages to buy one before spring. Wendell showed him how to use it properly one slow evening, pressing the probes into a fresh-cut piece and then into one that had dried for months. "Anything under 20%, you're getting close," Wen said. "Under 15, that's where I want it before it touches my pit." Terrell wrote the numbers down on a scrap of paper and taped it inside the lean-to, a rule he could check without having to remember it from memory every time. He learned that bark left on too long held moisture and mildew, so he started stripping it fully instead of just knocking off the loose pieces. He learned that customers wanted pieces close to the same size, so he started sorting chunks by hand into rough categories instead of bagging whatever came off the saw. None of this happened without friction. Other crew members at Briar Hill teased him for spending his breaks picking through crooked branches, while everyone else just wanted the burn pile cleared and gone. "You're spending more time sorting sticks than they're worth," one of the older hands told him, not meanly, just genuinely confused why anyone would bother. Terrell didn't have a clever answer for that yet, so he mostly just kept working and let the wood speak for itself later. At home, the sorting operation grew past the small lean to within a couple months, stacks of drying apple and cherry taking over a corner of the yard that used to be empty grass. Denise wasn't thrilled about it. "This yard is starting to look like a lumber yard," she told him one evening, arms crossed, looking at 3 new stacks he'd added that week. "It's making money," he said. "It's making a mess," she said back, but she didn't tell him to stop. And by the following spring, she'd stopped complaining altogether, mostly because the stacks had started paying down more than they were costing. A local firewood seller named Dwayne Pruitt heard about the operation through a mutual acquaintance and stopped by one afternoon just to see it for himself. He walked the rows of drying racks slowly, arms crossed, the way a man walks through something he's already decided isn't going to work. "Nobody's going to pay premium money for little pieces of apple branches," Dwayne said, looking over the drying racks with the flat certainty of a man who'd sold firewood for 20 years and never once separated it by species. "Maybe not from you," Terrell said, not sharp about it, just matter of fact. Dwayne laughed at that, more surprised than offended, and left without buying anything. Terrell didn't argue with him either. He just kept building. That spring brought its own operational problem, one that had nothing to do with customers or orchards, and everything to do with a leaking storage shed roof he hadn't gotten around to patching. A heavy rain soaked into one corner of his ready inventory overnight, and by the time he found it 2 days later, a patch of cherry chunks had started to mold along the outer edges. He lost most of that corner of the shed, close to 40 pounds of wood he'd already counted as sold in his head before it even happened. It wasn't the kind of failure that cost him a customer, but it cost him money and taught him the same lesson from a different angle. The system only worked if every part of it, even the roof over his head, held up its end. He patched the shed that weekend and started checking it after every hard rain from then on, a habit that cost him nothing but a few minutes and saved him from ever losing a batch that way again. By the second year, Terrell had outgrown Wendell's small kitchen as his only customer adding a barbecue trailer that traveled to weekend events, and a small smokehouse 2 towns over that had heard about the apple and cherry chunks through word of mouth. The smokehouse owner, a woman named Patricia Ellery who'd run her place for over a decade, looked him over pretty plainly the first time he walked in with a sample box. "How old are you?" she asked, not unfriendly, just direct. 20, he said. "And you're telling me you can keep me supplied with clean cherry chunks every week, all season, no gaps. I can show you 2 years of delivery records from another account if that helps," he said. She raised an eyebrow at that, clearly not expecting a teenager with a truck bed full of firewood to have paperwork, but she looked at the log anyway, dates and weights written out in his own plain handwriting. She placed a small trial order that day, the same way Wendell once had, and it grew into a standing weekly account within 2 months once the wood proved out. He hired his younger cousin, Marcus, no relation to the Kane family 2 counties over, just a coincidence of names common enough in that part of the state, to help with cutting and hauling once the volume outgrew what one person could manage after a full shift at the orchard. He added peach as a 3rd species that spring after enough customers asked whether he carried it, giving the business 3 distinct products instead of 2. Apple for mild, everyday smoke, peach for a sweeter profile popular with poultry and pork cooks, and cherry for a stronger, more distinct flavor that carried a slightly higher price. Demand kept climbing faster than his seasoning racks could keep up with, and that mismatch was where the real trouble started. A regional barbecue supply distributor called that summer, impressed by a sample a customer had passed along, and asked if Terrell could fill an order for 200 pounds of cherry chunks within 2 weeks for a big 4th of July promotion they were running across several restaurant accounts. It was the biggest order he'd ever been offered, more money in one shipment than his first 3 months of sales combined. The distributor's rep, a brisk woman named Sandra Cole, made it clear this could turn into a standing monthly account if the first shipment went well. Terrell sat with the phone still warm in his hand after the call ended, doing the math twice because the numbers seemed too good the first time. His seasoned cherry inventory wasn't close to 200 pounds. He had maybe 60 pounds properly dried, with another large batch still weeks away from ready by his own moisture standards. He told himself the difference wouldn't matter that much, that the greener wood would still burn fine mixed in with the seasoned pieces, that nobody would notice a few points of extra moisture in a shipment that size. He was afraid of losing the account before he'd even really had it, and that fear made the decision for him instead of his own standards. He filled the order, mixing the properly seasoned cherry with the greener batch, and shipped the full 200 pounds on time. For 3 days, nothing happened and he let himself believe he'd gotten away with it. Then the distributor called back, and the voice on the other end wasn't impressed anymore. Multiple restaurant accounts had complained the same weekend. Smoke too heavy, flavor bitter instead of sweet, one pitmaster describing it as tasting almost like it had been rained on halfway through the cook. Sandra didn't raise her voice on the call, which somehow made it worse. "We built a whole promotion around this," she said. "I told 4 accounts they could count on it." The distributor canceled the remainder of the contract on the spot and told Terrell, not unkindly but firmly, that reliability mattered more to them than a good first sample ever would. Terrell couldn't blame the weather for this one. He couldn't blame Briar Hill, and he couldn't blame the customer for expecting what he himself had promised them. He had known the wood wasn't ready, and he had shipped it anyway. He drove out that week and personally refunded the distributor in full, apologizing without making excuses, and ate the cost of the greener wood he couldn't resell at the price he'd charged. It hurt worse than the money. Wendell heard about it through the same small-town channel everything traveled through and asked him about it directly the next weekend at the restaurant. "You shipped it green because you were scared of losing them," Wendell said, not as a question. "Yeah," Terrell admitted. "That's the only mistake that matters in this business," Wendell told him. "Everything else you can fix with time. That one you fix by never doing it again." Terrell sat with that for a long stretch of driving home that night, turning the failure over the way he'd once turned over the burn pile and the little mesh bag at the register. The problem wasn't that he hadn't worked hard enough. The problem was that Briar Hill produced almost all of its pruning wood in one short winter window, while restaurants and distributors wanted smoking wood every single week of the year. Selling out of a seasonal harvest into a year-round market meant he could never let his inventory run down to nothing, because the next batch of raw material wouldn't exist again for months. He needed a real system, not just effort, and not just good intentions the next time an order came in bigger than he expected. He spent that fall building one. He tagged every batch with the date it was cut, keeping a written log instead of relying on memory the way he had before. He set a hard rule for himself: nothing shipped below a minimum seasoning threshold, checked with the moisture meter every single time. No exceptions, no matter how good the offer on the other end of the phone. He separated his racks into two clearly marked sections: green inventory still drying and ready inventory cleared for sale, so nothing from the wrong side could get mixed into an order by mistake again. He built simple first in first out shelving. Oldest ready batches sold first, so wood didn't sit past its usefulness or get forgotten in a back corner. He started keeping a reserve buffer of each species, never selling every pound of ready inventory even when an order tempted him to. So a slow month at the orchard or an early cold snap couldn't leave him empty-handed again. He also started weighing and photographing every batch before it left the property, a habit he'd picked up after realizing a written log alone hadn't been enough to stop him from cutting corners the one time it mattered most. Marcus thought some of it was overkill at first, joking that Terrell had turned a woodpile into a filing cabinet. Terrell didn't argue the point. He just kept doing it, week after week, until the habit stopped feeling like extra work and started feeling like the actual job. None of it happened overnight, but by the following spring, the operation ran on a schedule instead of on hope. He went back to Gilbert Hutto that year with something more structured than his original arrangement. He proposed that Briar Hill separate its pruning by species at the row level: apple pruning stacked in one collection bay, peach in another, cherry in a third, keeping treated or contaminated wood entirely out of the piles he'd be taking. In exchange, he'd clear the material on a fixed schedule instead of whenever he happened to have free time, which meant less material sitting around the yard for the crew to deal with, less labor spent dragging branches to the burn pile, and less smoke complaint risk during dry stretches when the orchard's insurance carrier got nervous about open burning. Gilbert listened to the whole proposal without interrupting, then asked how much volume Terrell actually thought he could move in a season. Terrell gave him real numbers this time, backed by 2 years of sales records instead of guesses. "And if I do all that sorting on my end," Gilbert said, "what's Briar Hill get out of it besides less mess?" "Lower disposal cost," Terrell said, "less crew time on the burn pile, and once volume's steady, I'll pay a per-load fee instead of taking it for nothing." Gilbert turned that over for a moment, the way a man does when the numbers actually add up better than his first instinct expected. Gilbert agreed to a trial for the next pruning season, and it worked well enough by the second week that he made it permanent. By year 3, Terrell had added a second orchard 20 minutes north, a smaller cherry-heavy operation whose owner had heard about the Briar Hill arrangement through the same small-town grapevine that had once carried word of his failed distributor shipment. The second orchard's owner, an older woman named Ruth Callahan, had run her family's cherry trees for 30 years and had never once thought about her pruning as anything more than a spring cleanup chore. She asked him the same question Gilbert once had, almost word for word, wanting to know how much volume he actually thought her rows could produce. He walked her orchard with a notepad before he answered, counting rows and estimating tonnage the way he'd learned to at Briar Hill, and gave her a number he could stand behind instead of one meant to impress her. She signed on for the same kind of arrangement he'd built with Gilbert: species sorted at the row, a fixed pickup schedule, a small per-load fee once volume proved steady. He had 4 employees drawing regular pay by then, cutting, sorting, and running 2 delivery routes to a growing list of restaurant and smokehouse accounts across the county and the one next to it. He'd added wholesale bags sold through a barbecue supply store in the next town over, packaged in standardized mesh sacks with printed labels listing species, weight, and a batch date customers could actually trust. The store owner had been skeptical the first time Terrell pitched him on carrying the bags, worried shelf space for smoking wood wouldn't move fast enough to justify it. 3 months later, he was asking for a bigger order, telling Terrell the labeled bags outsold the store's old unmarked bundles 2-1. Combined revenue across both orchards and all his accounts crossed into meaningful six-figure territory that year, landing somewhere in the range of $350,000. None of that was profit outright. 2 trucks, saw blades, packaging, fuel, 4 wages, a rented storage shed, and insurance all came out of that number before anything counted as real earnings. And Terrell tracked every one of those costs in the same plain notebook where he'd once logged his very first batch dates by hand. Dwayne Pruitt, the firewood seller, who once told him nobody would pay premium money for little pieces of apple branches, called that same year asking whether he could buy wholesale bags to resell out of his own lot. Terrell didn't bring up the old conversation. He just quoted him a wholesale price and asked how many bags he wanted delivered. Wendell still bought his apple and cherry every week, same as he had since that first 10-bag trial order, though the invoices had gotten a lot longer since then. "You were selling me green wood in feed sacks 2 years ago," Wendell said one afternoon, watching Marcus unload a clean pallet of labeled crates. "Look at you now." Terrell just shrugged and kept unloading. Gilbert Hutto became a different kind of presence in Terrell's week too, calling ahead of each pruning season now, instead of just letting the crews clear branches however was easiest. "Cherry starting Monday," he'd say, the same words that opened this story, and Terrell would check his rack space and tell him how much he could take. The power in that relationship had shifted without either of them ever needing to say so out loud. On a cold morning near the end of that third winter, Denise stood at the edge of the yard while Marcus and another worker loaded palletized boxes onto a truck, each one stamped clearly with April, peach, or cherry, and a batch date beneath it. She remembered without needing to say it, the year she'd called the whole yard a lumber yard and asked her son why he kept bringing home sticks nobody wanted. The truck pulled out past the old burn barrel that still sat at the edge of the property, unused most winters now, except for the material that truly had nowhere else to go. Rotted limbs, painted scraps, wood too far gone to season into anything worth selling. Not everything from the orchard was worth saving, but the piles that once rose taller than a flatbed trailer and disappeared into smoke were something else now, sorted by row, dried under cover, and loaded onto a truck that had somewhere specific to be. Denise stayed by the fence a while after the truck pulled out, watching the last of the morning frost burn off the empty rows further down the property. She didn't say anything about sticks that morning, and she didn't need to.